argument. You give me financial advice?
Only if you're ready to hear the truth.
Laughter burst through the night like champagne bubbles, wild and careless, echoing off glass walls and golden lights. The city glittered far below the rooftop restaurant, a playground for men who thought they owned the world. At the center of it all sat Richard Crane, heir to Crane Holdings, a name whispered on stock floors and printed on skyscrapers. His suit was tailored to perfection, his smile sharp enough to cut. He raised his glass as his friends roared over another crude joke about the working class. Then his gaze drifted past the table, past the flashing skyline, and landed on her, a waitress. Young, dark-skinned, Grace Daniels. She moved quietly between tables, steady hands balancing glasses worth more than her weekly pay. No makeup, no jewelry, just a small silver cross around her neck and eyes that carried something Richard hadn't seen in years. Peace. Boredom and arrogance twined together in his chest. He smirked. "Watch this," he muttered to his friends. "Let's see how deep wisdom runs in the service industry." As Grace approached, he leaned back in his chair, voice dripping with mock charm. "If you had my money," he said loudly, "what would you invest in?" His friends howled. One pulled out his phone, recording the moment. "Yeah, give us a masterclass, sweetheart." Another jeered. Grace froze mid-step. For a heartbeat, the world hushed. Only the faint clink of glass and city wind filling the silence. Then she turned, eyes calm, unreadable. She didn't flinch, didn't fumble. She simply looked at him. It wasn't defiance. It wasn't fear. It was stillness. The kind that unsettles those who thrive on power. "Excuse me?" she asked softly, as if confirming he'd truly asked what she thought he'd asked. Richard chuckled, swirling his wine. "You heard me. Humor me. You seem smart. What should a man like me do with all this money?" His tone was playful on the surface, but beneath it, sharp, mocking. His friends leaned in, ready to enjoy the humiliation. Grace set down the bottle she carried, her hands steady. "That depends, sir," she said. "Do you want to grow your money or your soul?" The laughter stalled, awkwardly caught between disbelief and confusion. Richard blinked, tilting his head. "My soul?" he repeated, half amused, half annoyed. "Sweetheart, I trade in numbers, not miracles." Grace didn't smile. "Maybe that's why you never seem to keep either." A ripple moved through the table. The man recording let his phone drop slightly, unsure whether to keep filming. One of the women at the table whispered, "Oh my God." Richard straightened, a flicker of irritation crossing his face. But there was something else beneath it. Something almost like curiosity. He leaned forward. "You think you've got me figured out, do you?" Grace shook her head gently. "I don't need to. I've served men like you all my life." Her tone wasn't bitter. It was matter-of-fact, calm, but edged with quiet truth that felt heavier than any insult. Richard's smile faltered. His friends shifted uneasily, the laughter dying out completely. The restaurant manager glanced over, sensing tension, but Grace gave a small, polite nod that said, "I'm fine." Richard tried to regain control, grinning again, louder now. "So tell me, waitress, what's your secret formula? Stocks? Crypto? Gold? What should I buy next?" Grace studied him for a long moment. The city lights reflected in her eyes like tiny stars. Sharp, knowing, infinite. Then she spoke, voice barely above a whisper, but cutting through the noise around them like a blade. "If I had your money, sir," she said slowly, each word deliberate, "I'd start by learning the value of what can't be bought." The air froze. For a moment, no one breathed. The laughter, the music, even the hum of the skyline seemed to dim. Richard's jaw tightened. The smirk vanished. He stared at her, not angry, but uncertain, as if her words had reached somewhere he didn't know existed. One of his friends muttered, "She's got a mouth on her," trying to laugh it off. But no one joined in. Grace simply gathered the empty glasses, nodded politely, and turned away. Richard watched her go, the sound of her footsteps fading into the quiet. And for the first time that night, the billionaire, who had everything, realized he had absolutely no idea what she meant, and why her words refused to leave his mind. The camera light from his friend's phone blinked red, still recording, but no one laughed anymore. For a long second, no one moved. Forks hovered above plates. Glasses trembled in half-raised hands. The rooftop's glow suddenly felt too bright, too hot, pressing down on everyone's skin. Grace's words still hung in the air like the last note of a hymn. I'd start by learning the value of what can't be bought. Everyone expected the explosion, the shouting, the firing, but it never came. Richard Crane leaned back slowly, eyes fixed on her like a puzzle he couldn't solve. The smirk on his face flickered, then returned, weaker this time. "That's quite the sermon," he said, voice smooth but uncertain. "You practice that line, or does it just come with the apron?" His friends laughed on cue, grateful for the release of tension. But the laughter sounded hollow. Grace didn't respond. She simply stood there, calm, unshaken, the city lights outlining her face. Richard tapped his glass with a finger. "You know," he went on, "most people who talk about value have never had any. So tell me, Miss Philosopher, what makes you so sure you understand it?" The restaurant manager, a middle-aged man with tired eyes, rushed forward, whispering urgently, "Mr. Crane, please, she didn't mean—" Richard waved him off without looking. "Relax, Mark. I'm curious." He turned back to Grace. "Well, you've got everyone's attention. Enlighten me." Grace drew in a quiet breath. She wasn't afraid, not anymore. "You asked what I'd invest in," she said. "I'd invest in people who remember where they came from." The table went still again. Richard tilted his head, mocking. "Sounds poetic. Completely useless, but poetic." Grace's eyes softened. "My father thought the same way," she said. "He owned a small grocery store downtown. Everyone trusted him. Then the market changed. Big companies came in. Prices dropped. He refused to lay off his workers or raise costs for families who were already struggling." Her voice wavered once, but she steadied it. "He said some things are worth more than profit." Richard crossed his arms, still half amused, half intrigued. "And let me guess, he lost everything?" Grace nodded. "He did. The store closed. The house went next. He died 2 months later. Heart failure, they said. But I think it was just heartbreak." The laughter died completely. Richard's friends exchanged uneasy glances. One whispered, "Man, this got dark." Grace went on, eyes distant now. "We sold his watch to pay for the funeral. That was the first time I realized what true poverty is. Not losing money, but losing meaning. That's when I learned. Wealth isn't how much you keep. It's how much you can survive losing." Silence. Even the city wind seemed to pause. Richard swallowed hard, pretending not to. There was something in her voice. A raw honesty that scratched against the walls of his arrogance. He tried to smile, but it came out awkward. "You're telling me a grocery store owner understood money better than me?" Grace's reply was soft. "No, sir. He understood life better." A faint gasp rippled across the table. One of the women whispered, "She's brave. I'll give her that." Richard stared at her for a long moment. Something inside him shifted, though he didn't want to admit it. The world suddenly looked different. His reflection in the wine glass didn't look as certain as before. He leaned forward slightly. "You really believe that, don't you?" Grace nodded once. "I have to. It's all I have left." The manager stepped in again, his voice trembling. "Grace, please." "That's enough. I'll handle this." But Richard raised a hand. "No, let her finish." She hesitated, then said quietly, "The richest thing my father left me wasn't money. It was dignity. You can lose a fortune overnight, but dignity, you only lose that when you sell your heart for the wrong kind of success. No one dared speak. The laughter, the arrogance, the rooftop chatter, all gone. Only Grace's steady voice and the hum of the city below remained. For the first time that evening, Richard didn't feel like a man in control. He felt like a boy being lectured by someone who had truly lived. And deep down, beneath the pride and ego, a flicker of curiosity sparked. He smiled slowly, forcing back whatever he felt. "All right, philosopher," he said, voice lower now. "Let's make this interesting." Grace frowned slightly, unsure where he was going. Richard leaned closer, eyes glinting. "You think your little wisdom can predict the value of things? Let's see if it can predict the market." A murmur ran through the table. His friends perked up, sensing entertainment again. Grace straightened, her calm unwavering. "And if it can't?" she asked. His smirk returned, crueler this time. "Then we'll find out how much your dignity's really worth." The skyline behind him pulsed with light, the city breathing beneath their pride and fear. Grace said nothing, but her eyes held firm, unbroken, and in that silence, something far bigger than money had already begun. The city's lights blurred through Grace's tears as she walked down the cracked pavement, her worn sneakers splashing through puddles left by the evening rain. The laughter from that rooftop still echoed in her ears, sharp, cruel, unforgettable. She kept her chin up, but inside, every word replayed, like a wound that refused to close. "Let's see if your values can predict the market." She should have ignored him. Should have just smiled, apologized, and walked away like every other time someone rich decided to make her feel small. But something about Richard Crane's smirk, that careless kind of power, had broken something inside her. Her breath trembled. She hated that he'd seen her eyes glisten when she turned to leave. The night air bit at her skin as she reached a dimly lit apartment building at the edge of downtown. The elevator was broken again, so she climbed the 4 flights of stairs, each step creaking beneath her. Inside their small one-bedroom apartment, a soft glow spilled from the corner. Her younger brother, Miles, sat at the table surrounded by books and half-empty cups of instant noodles. His head lifted when he heard the door. "Hey, Grace," he said, smiling sleepily. "You're late." She forced a smile back. "Double shift." "Go figure." He frowned when he saw the look on her face. "Rough night?" Grace dropped her bag and exhaled. "You could say that." Miles got up and handed her a cup of water. He'd grown taller lately, his shoulders filling out, but he still looked at her the same way, with that mixture of pride and worry only a little brother could have. "You want to talk about it?" he asked. Grace shook her head, sitting down heavily. "Just another man who thinks money makes him smarter." Miles chuckled softly. "They usually learn it doesn't," she smiled faintly. "Not always." The silence stretched. She stared at the stack of finance textbooks beside him. Borrowed, dog-eared, full of scribbled notes. She picked one up, running her finger over the underlined sentence on the page. "Wealth is only stable when built on understanding, not luck." Her father had written that once on a napkin when she was 15. She still kept that napkin folded in her wallet. Grace had been top of her class back then, a finance major with a scholarship and a dream of becoming an economist. Her professors called her the predictor because she could spot market shifts before they happened. She'd even won the Young Economists Award for a paper on ethical investing. Then everything fell apart. Her father's sudden illness drained every dollar they had. Medical bills piled like mountains. Insurance refused coverage. When he died, debt collectors came knocking within weeks. She'd dropped out of college, sold what little was left, and took the first job she could find. Waitressing. That was 3 years ago. Now, every night after her shift, she came home, washed off the smell of spilled wine and luxury perfumes, and opened those same textbooks, studying quietly while the city slept. Not because she still dreamed of riches, but because knowledge was the one thing no one could repossess. Miles touched her shoulder. "You're still thinking about that guy, aren't you?" She sighed. "He's just another rich man who thinks the world bends for him." "Then let him think it," Miles said softly. "You've got better things to build." She smiled at him, grateful for the reminder. He was the reason she kept going, the reason she refused to break. Later that night, when the lights were off and Miles was asleep, Grace sat by the window, the city stretching out like a restless ocean of light. She opened her notebook and scribbled a few lines. "Never answer mockery with anger. Let truth embarrass them on its own." Down in the street, a siren wailed. The world kept spinning. Across the city, in a penthouse that overlooked everything Grace could never afford, Richard Crane sat alone. The laughter from earlier had faded, replaced by a strange quiet. The expensive whiskey in his glass tasted bitter. He'd laughed at her, mocked her, but her words had clung to him like smoke. "I'd start by learning the value of what can't be bought." He set the glass down, restless. He'd been insulted before, by rivals, by executives, even by his father. But this felt different. It wasn't an insult, it was truth. He turned on his laptop, the glow lighting his face in the dark. Curiosity gnawed at him. He typed, "Grace Daniels Waitress, New York." Hundreds of results appeared, mostly restaurant reviews. But then one caught his eye. "Local teen wins Young Economist's Award. Predicts market trends with 90% accuracy." A grainy old photo loaded. Grace, years younger, standing proudly with a trophy, wearing a bright smile and her father's arm around her shoulder. Richard stared. Something twisted in his chest. This wasn't a waitress playing wise. This was someone who once had a future. Someone who'd fallen through the cracks his kind never even noticed. He leaned back in his chair, unsettled. The city outside looked emptier than usual. His penthouse, worth millions, suddenly felt like a glass box full of nothing. He replayed her voice in his head. Calm, steady, unbroken. "Some things are worth more than profit." He didn't know why, but he couldn't stop thinking about her. And before he realized what he was doing, he made a decision. He'd go back tomorrow. Not to apologize. That wasn't his style. But to test her again. To see if she was just lucky, or if she truly knew something he didn't. The billionaire who could buy anything suddenly found himself chasing the one thing he couldn't name. The restaurant hummed with low jazz and the clink of polished silverware. The same rooftop terrace, the same golden skyline. But this time, Grace felt the weight of 1,000 unspoken eyes when the maître d' whispered, "Mr. Crane has requested you personally." Her pulse stumbled. For a heartbeat, she thought of refusing. Then she straightened her apron and forced her steps steady. At the far corner table, Richard Crane sat alone. No friends, no laughter, no champagne this time, just a sleek black suit and a look that didn't belong to the same man who mocked her last night. When she approached, he smiled faintly. "I was hoping you'd still be working tonight." Grace met his gaze. "I usually am, Mr. Crane." He gestured toward the chair across from him. "Sit," she blinked. "I'm your server, sir, not your guest." He leaned forward. "Consider this, part of your service." There was something in his tone, not arrogance, but curiosity. Against her better judgment, she sat. "All right," she said. "What do you want?" Richard folded his hands, studying her. "I've been thinking about what you said yesterday. About value. About worth. You talk like someone who understands money better than most of the people I know." Grace arched a brow. "And yet you laughed." He smiled slightly. "Touché. Maybe that's why I can't stop thinking about it." He took a slow sip of wine, then set his glass down with precision. "So let's make it interesting. A challenge." Her stomach tightened. "A challenge?" One piece of investment advice, he said. If it works, I'll double your salary for life. You'll never need to serve tables again. If it doesn't, his voice softened, but the edge of pride still glinted beneath it. You quit this job. Walk away. The hum of the restaurant seemed to fade. Grace stared at him, searching for the trick in his eyes. You're betting my life against your ego? Call it motivation. She almost laughed. Almost. Instead, she sat back, weighing him. His confidence was absolute, but beneath it, she saw something else. Restlessness. Maybe even loneliness. I don't play games with livelihoods, she said quietly. He shrugged. You already did last night. You gambled your job when you talked back to me. Her jaw tightened. And I'd do it again, he grinned. Then say yes. Silence stretched between them. Then Grace drew a breath. Fine, one piece of advice. Richard leaned in, intrigued. She took a pen from her apron and wrote something on a napkin. When she slid it toward him, he frowned. Sell your holdings in Orion Technologies, she said simply. He blinked. Orion? That's my best-performing stock. It's up 40% this quarter alone. Exactly, she replied. And no company grows that fast without fire under the floorboards. Their CEO's been liquidating shares quietly. I read the filings. Their R&D budget doesn't justify their valuation. It's inflated hype, not innovation, he chuckled. You've done your homework. I always do, she said. That stock will tumble within a month, maybe 2. Pull out before it drags you with it. He tilted his head, eyes narrowing with amusement. You realize you just told a billionaire how to run his portfolio? She smiled faintly. You asked for truth, not flattery. He laughed, a genuine sound this time. You're bold. I like that. But even as he said it, he looked at her differently, as though her words had cracked something open. Grace wasn't dazzled by him. She wasn't trying to impress him. She was steady, unmoved by the luxury that defined his world. He tapped the napkin. All right, let's make it official. The bet stands. Fine, she said. But I'm not doing this for money. I just want you to see that numbers mean nothing without integrity behind them. Richard's smile faded slightly. Integrity doesn't pay the bills. Maybe not, she said softly. But it keeps you from owing more than you can ever repay. Their eyes locked. Something wordless passed between them. Pride and challenge, curiosity, and something that neither dared to name. For a long moment, Richard said nothing. Then he reached for his phone, sent a message to his broker, and looked back at her. Done. I've sold 10 million in Orion. Her breath caught. Just like that? He shrugged. If I'm wrong, I lose a few million. If you're wrong, he paused. You lose the safety net you're clinging to. She stood slowly, her expression unreadable. Then I guess we'll both see who really understands value. Richard watched her walk away, poised, calm, fearless. Every man in that restaurant noticed her now, but none of them understood what had just shifted in the air. As she disappeared through the kitchen doors, he found himself staring at the empty napkin, her handwriting looping neatly across it. Something in his chest stirred. Admiration, maybe, or unease. He didn't know why, but for the first time in years, a business decision made his heart race. An hour later, when Grace finished her shift, she found him still there, sitting in the same seat, staring out at the city lights. You're still here, she said. Surprised, he turned, a faint smile playing at his lips. Just thinking about what you said, she nodded, adjusting her coat. Then here's one more piece of free advice. Oh? He asked. Grace met his eyes, her voice steady but low. You don't see it yet, but the crash has already begun. She turned and walked away, leaving him alone with her words. And for the first time in his life, Richard Crane wasn't sure if he was about to lose money, or something far more valuable. The morning began with sirens, not the kind that echo through city streets, but the invisible ones that blare inside the minds of men who've just watched their empires fall. Richard Crane woke to the flashing, red of market alerts flooding his phone. Orion Technologies, down 63% overnight. His portfolio tracker bled crimson. Tens of millions evaporated before breakfast. He sat there, motionless in his penthouse, the skyline behind him glowing gold with dawn while his world dimmed. Notifications kept buzzing. Emergency board call in. 10. Investors demanding explanation. Stockholders panicking. His hands shook as he scrolled through the news headlines. Orion implodes. CEO steps down amid fraud probe. Overvaluation. Scandal wipes billions from market. Waitress. Predicted crash weeks ago. Video goes viral. He froze. There, she was, Grace Daniels, standing in her waitress uniform, eyes steady, voice calm. A recording from that night. Someone had uploaded it, and now it was everywhere. If I had your money, sir, I'd start by learning the value of what can't be bought. The clip looped over and over. Memes, talk shows, financial blogs calling her the prophet of Wall Street. Richard exhaled shakily, the weight of humiliation pressing down. For the first time in his life, his name wasn't being whispered in admiration. It was being mocked. His phone rang again. The board. Crane. What the hell were you thinking? A voice barked. You pulled $10 million out of Orion a week before the crash. The press thinks you had insider info. We're under investigation now. He swallowed hard. I made a personal call. A personal call? The voice dripped disbelief. Because of a waitress? The silence that followed was thick, suffocating. Then, click. They'd hung up. For a long time, Richard just sat there, the hum of the city below him like distant static. Everything he'd ever built, every boardroom victory, every calculated move, suddenly felt hollow. And somehow, that young woman's calm eyes haunted him more than the millions he'd lost. He closed his laptop and stood, staring out the window. Grace Daniels, he whispered. Who are you, really? Across town, Grace balanced a tray of coffee mugs in the tiny corner diner where she'd picked up extra shifts. The smell of fried eggs and burnt toast clung to the air. She hadn't slept. Her phone kept vibrating with notifications she tried to ignore. Reporters asking for interviews, strangers calling her a genius, others calling her lucky. But fame didn't pay the bills. On the counter beside the register lay a hospital invoice. The total made her chest tighten. Her brother, Miles, needed a second surgery. His heart condition was worsening, and insurance barely covered half. Grace pressed her fingers against her temples, trying to breathe. Grace, her manager said softly. You're trending again. Someone just said you should be working on Wall Street. She forced a small smile. I work where I'm needed. But inside, she was unraveling. The same world that mocked her one week now worshipped her the next. And none of it changed the fact that she couldn't save her brother yet. That evening, rain lashed against the diner windows. Grace wiped down tables after closing, humming to herself just to fill the silence. The door opened. She didn't look up. Sorry, we're closed. I know. That voice, calm, low, too familiar. Grace froze. Slowly, she turned. Richard Crane stood by the door, soaked from the rain. No chauffeur, no entourage, just a man stripped of everything that used to define him. She straightened, her heart skipping. You shouldn't be here, he smiled faintly. Probably not. But I didn't know where else to go. Grace set the cloth down, crossing her arms. Came to laugh again? Or to tell me you lost your fortune? I lost more than that, he said quietly. My pride, my certainty, maybe even my compass. Her eyes softened despite herself. I didn't want you to lose everything, Richard. He nodded slowly. You warned me. I just didn't listen. The sound of the rain filled the silence between them. Finally, he stepped closer. his voice lower now, stripped of arrogance, laced with humility. "Tell me something, Grace. How did you see it? What everyone else missed?" She hesitated, unsure whether to answer. He continued, almost pleading now. "Teach me. I need to understand how you saw what I couldn't." Her throat tightened. The billionaire who once mocked her was standing here. Eyes tired, voice raw, seeking truth instead of victory. Grace looked down at the counter where drops of rain from his coat pooled into small circles. "It's not about numbers," she said softly. "It's about people. Greed leaves patterns, desperation, silence, denial. If you stop chasing profit long enough to listen, the truth tells you where the cracks are." Richard nodded slowly, as if memorizing every word. When he finally looked up, there was no smugness left, just sincerity. "Then let me listen. Let me learn." Grace studied him for a long, silent moment. She could feel her brother's hospital bill burning a hole in her apron pocket, could hear the faint echo of every insult she'd endured in her life. And yet something in Richard's voice felt different. "All right," she said finally, her voice calm but steady. "If you really want to learn, you start tomorrow. 6 a.m. here." A faint smile tugged at his lips. "Here?" she nodded. "If you can't handle a diner's chaos, you're not ready for the markets." He chuckled quietly, and for the first time since the crash, the sound wasn't hollow. As he turned to leave, Grace called out, "Richard!" He looked back. "Don't be late." The bell above the diner door jingled softly as he stepped into the storm. And Grace stood there, watching him disappear into the rain, wondering if she'd just made the biggest mistake of her life, or the beginning of something that might change both of theirs forever. The morning light poured through the diner windows like a quiet apology. Grace was refilling coffee mugs when she noticed the expensive black car parked outside, polished, perfect, and completely out of place in her world. A moment later, Richard Crane stepped through the door. No bodyguards this time, no press, just him in a simple gray suit that somehow still screamed wealth. "Morning," Grace said, cautious but calm. "Didn't think billionaires woke up before sunrise." He smiled faintly. "I didn't sleep." He slid a folder across the counter. "Inside is a contract. 6 figures. Executive analyst position. You start tomorrow." The diner went silent. Even the cook peeked over the counter, eyes wide. Grace didn't open the folder. "You're serious?" "As a heart attack," he said. "You saw what my best men couldn't. I want you on my team, Grace. You'll never have to serve tables again." Her heart skipped, not from temptation, but from something heavier. For a brief moment, she imagined it. Her brother's hospital bills paid off, a proper home, freedom. It was everything she'd once prayed for. But she looked at him, the same man who'd once mocked her wisdom, now dangling gold like forgiveness. And something inside her whispered, "No." She pushed the folder back gently. "I can't accept it," Richard blinked. "Excuse me?" "I'm not for sale, Richard." He laughed, soft, disbelieving. "You think this is about buying you?" "I think it's about clearing your conscience," she said. "You lost money. But I think what really scared you was realizing money can't make you wise." The air between them tightened. He leaned forward, tone defensive. "You'd rather spend your life waiting tables when you could be changing the market?" Grace shook her head. "I don't want to change the market. I want to change people." He frowned, genuinely confused. "People?" Grace's voice softened. "Families who live paycheck to paycheck. Mothers drowning in credit card debt. Students who think they'll never escape their loans. I want to teach them what no one ever taught us. How money works. How not to be trapped by it." For a moment, Richard just stared, caught between admiration and disbelief. "That's noble, but naive. The world doesn't run on kindness, Grace." She smiled sadly. No, it runs on fear, and I'm tired of being afraid. Her words landed like stones in his chest. He'd heard analysts, professors, consultants, but never anyone speak with that kind of conviction. He tried again, gentler this time. Let me fund your dream then. Open your workshops, run your program. I'll back it all. Grace hesitated. For a flicker of a second, hope sparked. But she saw the same pattern again, power dressed as generosity. I appreciate it, she said softly. But if you fund it, it's yours. Not mine, he swallowed, eyes searching hers. You're walking away from everything people beg me for. I'm walking toward what I was meant to do. Grace untied her apron, laid it neatly on the counter, and looked him in the eye. You taught me something without meaning to, Richard. The richest people are often the ones still trying to buy peace of mind. Richard didn't answer. He couldn't. She stepped around him toward the door. You'll figure out your purpose, too. Maybe then we'll meet again. Not as a waitress and a billionaire, but as two people who finally understand what value really means. The bell above the diner door jingled as she stepped into the sunlight. Richard stood there, frozen. Outside, Grace crossed the street with her usual poise. Shoulders back, eyes forward, like someone walking not away from wealth, but toward freedom. For the first time in years, he felt something that no number could measure. Respect. He sat down in her empty booth, staring at the untouched contract. Around him, the diner buzzed back to life. Laughter, orders, clinking dishes. Real life. He opened his phone out of habit, but this time, the stock charts didn't hold his attention. Instead, he searched for something else. Community finance education programs. Her words echoed in his mind. I want to teach them what no one ever taught us. And as the screen loaded, Richard Crane, a man who'd always chased power, found himself, for once, curious about something far more difficult to earn: purpose. Outside, Grace disappeared into the morning crowd, unaware that her refusal had planted a seed in the heart of a billionaire. And by the next sunrise, he wouldn't be able to stop thinking about her words. The shouting in the boardroom was deafening. Richard sat at the end of the long marble table, watching the people he'd once trusted turn into vultures. Faces that used to smile at him now carried the cold expression of strategy and survival. Crane, one of the directors said, his tone sharp. You've cost this company over $1 billion in failed projections. It's time for a change. Richard's jaw tightened. We took risks because that's what growth requires. Growth? Another voice cut in. You gambled our future. You let emotion cloud your judgment. You're done. The words hit harder than he expected. Done. A simple word, but it carried the weight of everything he'd built. His father's legacy, his reputation, his name. When the vote came, it was unanimous. Even his closest ally, Paul, the man he'd mentored from nothing, avoided his eyes as he raised his hand in favor of removal. Richard stood, silent. No arguments left, no allies remaining. Just the slow, hollow sound of his own footsteps leaving the empire he'd ruled. That night, his mansion felt like a museum of ghosts. The chandeliers glimmered, the art was still priceless, but the silence made it all feel worthless. He poured himself a drink, but it burned bitter on his tongue. On the grand piano lay a forgotten napkin, the same one Grace had scribbled a note on weeks ago. You only measure success by what you can count. He stared at the words until they blurred. For the first time in his life, he didn't understand what success meant anymore. The phone buzzed. Messages from people who once called him genius now called him reckless. Invitations dried up. The media feasted on his failure like sharks on blood. He tried calling old friends, but none answered. Not one. By midnight, he was sitting in the dark, the city lights shimmering beyond his window. His reflection stared back, tired, unshaven, smaller somehow. He whispered to himself, "What do you count when there's nothing left to measure?" Days turned into weeks. Richard sold his penthouse, his cars, even the private jet that once symbolized his power. Each sale felt like peeling away a layer of armor, leaving him raw, unprotected. He moved into a smaller apartment downtown. No more assistants, no more staff. Just him and silence. But something strange began to happen. For the first time, he started noticing things he never had before. The street vendor who gave free food to hungry kids, the janitor who greeted everyone with a smile, the sound of laughter echoing from alleys after school. He realized that life kept going, even without him controlling it. One rainy afternoon, he wandered through the city aimlessly, lost in thought. His shoes splashed through puddles, his suit wrinkled and damp. He passed the neighborhoods he used to avoid, where windows were cracked, and walls were covered in faded paint and graffiti. And then he stopped. On a brick wall, painted in bright blue letters, was a sign, the Daniels Center for Financial Hope. He blinked, thinking his mind was playing tricks on him. Beneath the name, smaller words read, "Empowering Families, Building Futures." Grace. He stood frozen in the rain, staring at the building. Modest, maybe 50 people inside, but alive with energy. Kids laughing, volunteers talking, the hum of real change. Something stirred in him. The last time he saw her, she'd turned down his offer with quiet conviction. And now she had done it. Built something from nothing. He hesitated before stepping forward. His reflection in the glass door was unrecognizable. Not the billionaire, not the tycoon, just a man humbled by the world. He opened the door quietly. The sound of laughter and chatter wrapped around him like warmth after a long winter. Inside, rows of children sat at tables, learning how to budget using toy money. On a small stage, Grace stood with a whiteboard behind her, explaining how dreams weren't built on luck, but on knowledge. Her voice was steady, her presence radiant. "It's not about how much you have," she said, writing in big letters. "It's about how much you understand." The kids nodded eagerly. Some smiled. Some raised their hands with questions. Richard stood at the back, unnoticed, watching her transform the same wisdom he once mocked into something beautiful, powerful, and real. A young boy tugged on his sleeve, whispering, "You here for Miss Grace's class?" Richard managed a small smile. "I guess I am," the boy grinned. "She's the smartest person in the world." "You'll see." Richard's throat tightened. He looked at Grace again, realizing this was the first time in his life he'd witnessed true wealth. The kind that couldn't be counted, only felt. And as she turned slightly, catching his gaze from across the room, a flicker of recognition crossed her face. For a moment, neither spoke. But the look said everything. The past, the lessons, the unspoken forgiveness. Richard took a breath, standing taller than he had in months. He didn't know what he was supposed to do next. But he knew one thing for sure. The man who had walked into that center wasn't the same one who'd walked out of that boardroom. Grace turned back to her students, smiling. And in the back of the room, Richard Crane, once a billionaire, now just a man trying to rebuild his soul, stayed, listening like a student who had finally found his teacher. Outside, the rain eased into sunlight, and the city, for once, didn't feel so cold. The sound of children's laughter faded as Grace turned toward the doorway. The moment her eyes met Richard's, the room seemed to hold its breath. For a heartbeat, she didn't move, unsure if he was real or just a ghost from a chapter she'd long closed. He looked nothing like the man who'd once mocked her behind designer suits and cold smiles. His eyes, once sharp with arrogance, now carried the quiet ache of a man who'd fallen and learned. "Grace," he said softly, voice trembling, I didn't know where else to go. She studied him for a long moment, then nodded toward the hallway. Let's talk. In the small staff lounge, away from curious eyes, the silence stretched. Rain tapped gently on the windows. Richard's hands fidgeted on his lap. A billionaire once in command of thousands, now unable to control a single sentence. Finally, he spoke. I was wrong. About everything. About you. About what matters. Grace folded her arms, not coldly, but protectively. Richard, this isn't about being right or wrong. It's about who you were trying to be. I was trying to be my father, he said, voice low. And he was trying to be his. Every generation counting numbers, never people. You told me that once. Grace's expression softened. And now you understand? He nodded slowly. Too late, maybe, but yes. I thought power meant control. I thought money bought respect. But the more I had, the less I saw. You tried to open my eyes, and I laughed in your face. Her tone gentled, but her words carried truth. We all have blind spots, Richard. The real question is what we do when we finally see. He looked down, tears threatening. I hurt people. I burned bridges. I built walls so high I couldn't see the ground anymore. But when I saw your name on that center, he stopped, voice cracking. It made me realize what real building looks like. Grace exhaled slowly. I forgave you a long time ago, but forgiveness doesn't mean forgetting. I don't want to forget, he said quietly. I want to remember every mistake, because they're the only things that feel real now. As the evening deepened, the two sat together, the tension dissolving into conversation that felt almost like old friends rediscovering each other. They talked about the children Grace taught, kids who dreamed of college but couldn't afford notebooks. They spoke of systems that rewarded greed over goodness, and of how the world needed more people who built bridges instead of empires. You built something here, Richard said, glancing around the modest center. Something that matters, Grace smiled faintly. I just gave people tools. The rest was them. And what if more people had those tools? He asked, eyes brightening with an old but different kind of fire. What if financial literacy, business mentorship, entrepreneurship, all of it, were free? Accessible to anyone? Grace tilted her head. You're talking about scale. That takes funding, infrastructure, coordination. He chuckled softly. Funding I can still manage. Infrastructure I can learn. She raised a brow. You'd do that? After everything? He hesitated, then nodded. I don't want my name on it. Not this time. I just want to help. Grace looked at him long and hard, searching for ego. There was none. Just quiet sincerity. All right, she said finally. Then we'll do it together. And that night, under the warm hum of flickering lights and the faint scent of coffee, they began drafting the foundation of what would become the Future Wealth Initiative, a global program designed to teach financial wisdom to low-income youth, not as charity, but as empowerment. Richard worked quietly. No press, no investors, no corporate banners, just spreadsheets, late nights, and handwritten notes filled with ideas Grace inspired. For the first time, he wasn't chasing profit. He was building purpose. Grace noticed the change. His posture was humbler, his laughter softer. Sometimes she caught him watching the kids in awe, as if rediscovering the world he'd once ignored. One evening, after closing the center, Grace found him sitting alone, staring at a mural the children had painted. Hands of all colors reaching toward a golden sun. You really mean to stay, don't you? She asked. He smiled. For the first time in my life, I don't want to leave. Grace nodded slowly. Then maybe you've finally found your wealth. Weeks later, the center buzzed with excitement. Enrollment tripled. Donations poured in, anonymous ones, large enough to sustain operations for years. Grace knew where they came from, but she respected his wish for silence. Then, one crisp morning, a journalist appeared at the door. Notebook in hand, camera slung over her shoulder. Miss Daniels? She asked politely. I'm doing a story on Richard Crane, the fallen billionaire. Sources say he's been spotted around this neighborhood. Any comment? Grace paused, glancing toward the classroom where Richard knelt beside a group of kids, helping them balance their mock budgets. He laughed as one boy tried to sneak an extra income under the table. Grace smiled, a small, knowing smile that held both truth and grace. Yes, she said. He's richer than ever now. The journalist blinked, confused. I'm sorry? Grace turned back toward the class, her voice calm but radiant. You can tell your readers that Richard Crane found the kind of wealth you can't lose, and the kind the world desperately needs. The journalist scribbled the words, not fully understanding their weight, but Grace did, because in that moment, watching the man who had once ruled the world now teaching a child how to save $1, she saw redemption in motion, quiet, steady, and real. Outside, the city lights began to glow again, and somewhere deep in Grace's heart, she knew this wasn't the end of the story, only the beginning of a new kind of empire. The city skyline shimmered beneath a new dawn, not of glass and steel, but of quiet hope. Outside Grace Daniels Community Center, a line of families stretched down the block. Mothers held their children's hands, fathers clutched notebooks, teenagers scrolled through online registration forms. They weren't here for charity. They were here to learn, to grow, to change. Inside, the air buzzed with energy. The chalkboard read, Financial Literacy 101, Building What Lasts. At the front, Grace stood with the same calm confidence she once carried through crowded restaurant aisles. But now, it came with something deeper. Purpose, fulfilled. Behind her, Richard Crane adjusted folding chairs, laughing as a group of kids teased him for dropping a stack of flyers. The billionaire who once lived in penthouses now wore rolled-up sleeves and a humble grin, and he had never looked more at peace. As Grace began her lesson, her voice carried a quiet power. Wealth isn't measured by what we keep, she said. It's measured by what we give and what we build in others. The crowd listened, captivated. Somewhere in the back, a man recorded her on his phone. That simple clip, Grace teaching in a modest classroom, sunlight streaming through cracked windows, would soon go viral again. But this time, not as mockery, as inspiration. The same internet that once called her the waitress who embarrassed a billionaire now renamed her the woman who redefined wealth. Weeks passed. News channels ran stories about the Future Wealth Initiative, community programs spreading across the country, funded quietly by anonymous donors. Some whispered that Richard Crane was behind it. Others dismissed it as rumor. He never confirmed it. When asked, he only smiled and said, "It's not about who gives, it's about who grows." Grace's brother, Miles, graduated college that spring, debt-free, thanks to scholarships created through the initiative. When he hugged his sister on stage, the audience rose to their feet. Grace wiped her tears, proud not of what she'd gained, but of what she'd overcome. She still lived simply. A small apartment, a second-hand car, the same coffee shop mornings. But her life felt vast, rich in laughter, in impact, in gratitude. And every weekend, Richard still showed up to volunteer. Sometimes he swept floors. Sometimes he handed out snacks. Sometimes he just listened. Grace never treated him like a fallen billionaire, and he never acted like one. They were equals, two people rebuilt by humility and hope. One evening, as the sun dipped low over the city, Grace locked up the center and found Richard sitting on the steps, watching the sky burn gold. "Long day?" she asked. He smiled faintly. "The good kind." They sat in silence for a moment, listening to the hum of traffic and distant laughter. "You know," he said quietly, "I used to think wealth meant never having to wait for anything. But the best things, they take time. Grace nodded. And patience. And faith. He looked at her, eyes warm. You taught me both, she chuckled softly. No, Richard. You taught yourself. You just needed a reason. For a while, they said nothing more. The city lights blinked on one by one, tiny beacons of persistence against the dark. Grace's voice, steady, wise and full of heart, carried over the closing scene, as if narrating the lesson the whole story had been building toward. True wealth isn't power. It isn't privilege. It isn't the applause of the world. True wealth is the courage to lift others when the world mocks you for trying. It's the grace to keep giving when no one's watching, and it's the peace of knowing that the richest lives are the ones spent in service. The montage unfolded. Families learning, children saving, communities thriving. The same city that once laughed at a waitress now followed her example. The screen faded to black, leaving only her voice. Share this story and remind someone that respect and wisdom outshine fortune. And with that final line, the light of Grace Daniels's legacy burned on, steady, simple, and brighter than gold.